So under our Labs tab, this one obviously used frequently, a more broad overview. We have our sort of settings, view settings here on the left. Currently, we have most recent selected, which is the default setting. We can have a date range, either custom if we select this radio button, or any of the other options. Currently, it's set to all results, which is fine. For a test patient, there aren't many results, unfortunately, so we'll limit what we're able to review. We can scroll through one at a time by clicking the previous button. As you can see, it's just going in chronological order, scrolling through the labs. We can select oldest, newest, if we want to just go all the way to the end on either end. Other really helpful views, I strongly recommend using the worksheet view. What this does is allows you to view the test results in a specific way. So I've made some test groups here, which we'll go through, but say you wanted a CBC, you type in CBC in the lab test box, and you say add, because you can actually add a number of things here. Maybe you, for some reason, also want to order or review a chemistry at the same time as your CBC, which, as you can see, there are a number of tests here, so it would get to be a lot to look at, but we could also add that. And now we have both of them in the same thing. We can rearrange, say we don't want our glucose to be the first thing, and we want our chemistry to go in order. So we select sodium and we move it up, select potassium, move it up, select chloride, move up bicarb, move it, BUN, creatinine, EGFR, anion gap, and then we missed our glucose, so move our glucose down after creatinine. So then now it's in a sort of lab skeleton order. We'll select OK, and now it's going to show all of these things. And because there are so many, we would have to scroll over to see them all. You can sort of scooch these down if you really wanted to, but it's more effort than it's worth. You can also select the date range. As you can see, this is going to set up your lab result as a column and the dates as a row. And as is evident here, even though there are no values, the columns are wider than the rows by a pretty significant amount. Even if we drag these down to where they're still legible, which you wouldn't want to take the time to do for everyone anyway, they'll always be shorter. So it makes it very easy to see what the range of these values was over a pretty significant amount of time, maybe depending on how many tests the patient has had drawn. But you can select your date range here, and this will load up all of the tests from the last 2 years. So you can very easily see the trend. If you go back to the worksheet view, we'll remove all of these. As I mentioned, you can create your own test groups. Unfortunately, you have to select these one at a time, but you can create them by removing tests. So what this does is if I click on this, it's going to input all of these to be displayed down here. As this says, to create a new test group, you're limited to 7 tests. So a bit frustrating when obviously we can fit more than 7 tests across this screen. It seems a bit limiting, but maybe that's a limitation of an old technology. But we can add multiple, so we can do our basic chemistry, our liver panel, and our mineral panel all in one. And as we click each one, it adds it in, and we can say, OK, and then boom, automatically everything appears in a row, and we can review each thing. So to create these from scratch, if you're here at the DC VA, you can simply type in my name and hit enter, and it will show these. And what you can do is select this. For me, it just populates it down here. For someone else, you would select new, and it'll say, do you want to create a new test group with these tests? And you could say yes, and then it will input it under your own name. I give you permission to take all of the tests I create. If you wanted to create a new one from scratch, sorry, I should have hit remove all. You could say chem7, type this in and say add, then rearrange it however you want, right? And you can count them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Well, there are 9 things here. So in order to create a group, right now this is grayed out. We're not able to create a group with this. We need to remove 2 things that we think are the lowest priority. So maybe the EGFR and the glucose or the anion gap, right? So now we've removed the anion gap and we can create a new test. So now this button is available. This is an easier way than trying to create it by each test individually, where you would enter sodium and add sodium, potassium and add potassium, etc. So easier to remove one at a time until you get to 7. Maybe not for something like the CBC, which, as we saw, provided a number of tests. So this you could choose what's your preferred way to enter it. If you wanted to designate a specific specimen, you can. And that is the worksheet view. This is how I view lab tests almost exclusively, unless there are things that are non-standard that would be hard to make a test group for. Otherwise, this makes it very easy to review the labs, review trends in particular, which are always relevant to our patients. Next, there is a graph. There's a graph on this as well, as you can see under other formats. If you wanted to, you could change the table format and reverse it the other way, but it's a lot harder to review trends horizontally than it is reviewing the trends vertically. So I recommend leaving it in this default view. Also, you can flip from comments. Comments will sometimes be available for lab tests where it will say if the specimen is hemolyzed, for example, or any other potential relevant comment. You can select graph instead. In that case, it will create a graph if our patient had labs to review. If you really like the visual to look at the trend, I personally don't find that as helpful as just looking at the numbers where it's easy to identify the specific numbers, but you can do the graph. If you select the graph, then these other options become available. You could add the values to the graph, depending on how much time you're showing, might affect how clear that information is, etc. There's a separate graph section, which is just graphs. That gets very specific, allowing you to search through any number of tests. Maybe easier to just use the graph under the worksheet view, but you could do it that way as well. You can do test by date, which I use very infrequently, but maybe could be relevant if you are looking for a specific date range, or patient thought some test was done a couple of years ago but wasn't sure. Microbiology shows up here. This is all of our culture data. Again, unfortunately, our patient has no culture data, but this is where that information is found. Anatomic pathology, interestingly, is found here or also in the reports tab, but pathology specimen results return in this section. Blood bank can be helpful for specific things. In particular, you can see our red blood cell order is here, and then this is the area where you want to look to determine whether your patient has received the units. So this will say whether the units were transfused and when, similar to an MAR, will appear in this blood bank section. Cumulative labs will list the labs that the patient has had drawn in this box, and you can select them. Unfortunately, our patient just doesn't have labs, so we can't look at them, but this will list sort of a column view where you can look at trends and each column is a date. So you can see a recent trend of 3 or 4 dates, but not as useful as the worksheet view when viewing trends over time.